So welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight, and today Ralph Ellis is back, and we are going to talk about the historical Jesus, and we will see what we are going to unearth here. So, Ralph, welcome back. Very happy to have you here. Very excited about the subject, and yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it. Thanks for having me back on again, Judith. Yeah, this is going to be an interesting talk about the true gospel story. I don't think it's too complex, but there are some new information that people might not understand. So if you don't understand what I'm saying, do break in and ask a question, because if you don't understand it, then your viewers may not as well. So we're going to be talking about Edessa, and I want to prove to viewers that Jesus was a real historical character.
Yeah. Can you, I mean, you have spent so much time, if I'm correct, then more than 20 years
Yes.
unearthing this historical Jesus.
Yes. It's been...
Can you understand that there are still people who say, I have my doubts about this Jesus character, that he ever existed?
Yes, of course they do, because it's challenging. So if you're very open-minded as a Christian, you can say, hooray, we found the real Jesus. This, it proves that our beliefs and our religion was correct. But if you look at it with a more fundamentalist mind, if you come from a Catholic or something background, then it will be challenging, and you will say, oh, I don't like that Jesus. It's not the Jesus that I understand him to be, and therefore I'm going to reject him, because we've been told this story by the Catholic Church, that Jesus is a pauper Prince of Peace, and I'm going to show you a Jesus that's not a Jesus that is a monarch, a real monarch, who was involved in a real revolution, because we all know that from the gospel story that Jesus was a revolutionary in some manner. And we all know that he was a king in some manner. But then they try to say, well, it wasn't really a revolution. It was only a sort of spiritual revolution. And he wasn't a real king. He was just a carpenter, really. A carpenter king. We often have carpenter kings. No, that's not the real story. The real story is, yes, he was involved in a revolution, and he was a real king. And then the problem becomes, how can you lose a king in the first century? Because this is quite a literate period in history. We have all of the information pretty much. So how can we lose a real king in the first century who has gone missing from history? Well, there has been one, and I think you should have a map has come up there in the share.
Yeah, I can see it.
Right. It's just so that before we start, we can home in on what we're looking at here. So this is Syria, Mediterranean Sea on the left, Judea down the bottom. You can probably see my cursor going round and round Jerusalem. You run up through Syria and you come to, well, Palmyra is out here in the Syrian desert. We might talk about Palmyra. Damascus is here. Aleppo up here, and then we want to go slightly northeast of Aleppo, and we come to Edessa. Now, most people will not have heard of Edessa, but it is actually pivotal. Even in classical Christianity, it's a pivotal location, which is surprising that people don't know about it nowadays, because, 800 years ago, down in the sort of Middle Ages, people all knew about Edessa. People used to go on pilgrimages to Edessa. Madame Egeria And she came from, where did she come from? I think she came from Gaul, from France. She did a pilgrimage to Edessa in the 4th century on her own. Well, she had some helpers, of course, but essentially she was on her own. And she went to Edessa to pay her respects to Edessa because it was central to Christianity. But it's been lost from history. And Edessa had its own monarchy, very influential. It was an independent principality, subservient to Rome, of course, so they were under Roman control, but they had their own independent principality, and as we'll see later, they were Jewish as well. They were Nazarene Jews. So, yeah, this comes from my book, Jesus, King of Edessa. Sorry, King Jesus. I started with King Jesus because I hadn't found Edessa. It was so obscure that I didn't even know that this city existed. So I wrote King Jesus, which is all about why he should be considered to be a real king, taking all of the history from the Talmud and from other original documents. And that's quite an interesting book. I mean, it's 500 pages, and it sets out the reason why this guy should be considered a real king. And then I found...
Excuse me, one question. Is that deliberate? Because this Jesus on that cover, King Jesus, he strikes me as a Knights Templar.
Yeah, no, that's deliberate. There are lots of connections here with the Knights Templar, which we will find as we go through. Remember, the community rule of the Knights Templar is the same as the community rule of the Essenes, the 1st century group down on the Dead Sea at Qumran. They're virtually identical. So there are lots of connections. And of course, the Templars were in the Near East because that's where they went to on the Crusades. And they found out a lot of this information. And that was one of the central secrets that the Templars had, in my opinion. We all know the Templars had secrets. What were those secrets? Those secrets were the original historical accounts of the Gospels and Jesus. So they, in my view, they found what I have found when they went to the Near East. But of course, that information was heretical. So it was very difficult to handle. What do you do with it? You have to keep it secret. And that's why the Templars had this secret sort of society. So yes, that's why I've portrayed him as a Templar. And then I wrote a book about Queen Helena, who was the queen of Edessa. But it turned out to be another book entirely, because even when I was writing that book, I got about a third of the way through the book on Queen Helena, and then I found Edessa, and it just turned the book around completely. And so it became this book, which is Jesus, King of Edessa, because I found Edessa, and Queen Helena turned out to be the queen of Edessa, which I didn't know, and most people don't know. We'll run through that in a minute. Yeah, she was the queen of Edessa. And we can show that Edessa was very closely linked to the gospel story. So that became this book, Jesus, King of Edessa. And that portrait, yeah, incidentally, is based on this, which is Queen Zenobia. Now, there's another queen that people won't know about. She was the queen of Palmyra out in the Syrian desert. But she was like early 3rd century. And she took over Rome. She became emperor of Rome. Except her... Go ahead.
In the background, is that Helios?
In the background. Oh, yes, on the left, that's Helios, yeah.
Okay.
There is this fusion between Greek and Israelite Hebrew religion here. We'll see this in a minute. They are very closely linked. And so, yes, they had, Helios, Sol, the sun god, And that was their primary religion, but that was very closely linked to the Nazarene religion of Jesus and James anyway. So
Is
I
she
took this image.
wearing shackles?
Yeah, she was captured.
Okay.
She led a revolt against Rome, very much the same as we're going to see with the Jesus character. She led a revolt against Rome, which was quite successful. She took over all of Egypt, all of the Near East. She took over all of Anatolia, modern Turkey, and she very, very nearly became the emperor of Rome. But she was defeated and captured, and that's why she's in chains. And she was carted off to Rome as a prisoner of Rome. But because of these similarities, and because Edessa controlled Palmyra, it was one of their capital cities. So there was a big link here between Edessa and Palmyra. I use this image almost exactly to be my image for the Jesus King of Edessa character, because they controlled Palmyra. So yeah, that's interesting. And then I go on to, we'll talk about this in another talk, but the links between the gospel story and Arthurian legend, they are interesting as well, but we won't talk about that. So I'll stop sharing for a minute and come back to you and explain why I think the Jesus character and the gospel story is connected with Edessa, because people won't have heard of Edessa and they'll be wondering, there are no links. We can't see any links with Edessa. What are you talking about? Well, here's a link with Edessa. This comes from both Josephus and Moses of Corine. It's talking about the execution of John the Baptist. So a lot of people think this is just a biblical story. It's not. This comes from real history, which is interesting because it proves that John the Baptist was a real historical character. So what happened? Well, Herod Antipas, one of the tetrarchs of Judea, he had married the daughter of Aretas, the king of Petra, the rose-red city down in southern Jordan. And but when he, this is from Josephus, he says, when Antipas had lodged with Herod Philip, who was his brother, he fell in love with Herodias, Philip's wife, which he shouldn't have done, of course. And he wanted to marry Herodias. But in order to marry Herodias, he had to send the daughter of Aretas back down to Petra. Her name was Pharsalus. So he divorced her and sent her back home again. Now, the king of Petra was not impressed about this, and John the Baptist was not impressed either. So John the Baptist said this marriage was illegal for various reasons. So he made a complaint, of course, and he managed to get his head cut off and taken on a platter to Herod. But Aretas, the king of Petra, was not impressed by this either. So he sent an army to go and punish Herod Antipas. So, and we get an account of this from Josephus. So Josephus Flavius, he says, Aretas made war between him and Herod Antipas and raised armies on both sides and prepared for war. And when they had joined battle, all of Herod's army was destroyed by the treachery of some fugitives who were from the tetrarchy of Philip, who joined with Aretas's army. So another force came down to help Aretas defeat Herod Antipas. But Josephus won't tell us who they were. And that's a red flag from the start, because Josephus knows everything that goes on in the first century in Judea. So why is he not telling us who these people were? Well, I say because he is being told by Rome, by Emperor Vespasian, when he was writing these texts, to delete these people from history. And so he calls them the treachery of some fugitives from Syria. Okay, so who are the fugitives? Well, we go to Moses of Corinne, who's an Armenian Syriac historian, and he gives us the answer. And he says, King Abgarus, now there's a new name for people. He was the king of Edessa, Abgarus. King Abgarus allied himself with Aretas, the king of Petra, and gave him some auxiliary troops to make war on Herod Antipas. Being sharply attacked, Herod's troops were defeated thanks to the help of the brave Edessans. As if by divine providence, vengeance was taken for the death of John the Baptist. Now that's interesting because that fills in two very large gaps that Josephus leaves us. It tells us that Josephus is being very selective with his history. He will leave people out if he doesn't want you to know about them. So the fugitives from Syria is the Edessan army. That's interesting. So now we know that Edessa is closely involved in this story. But why were the Edessans down there? We know why Aretas was upset. It was because his daughter was sent home. Why were the Edessans upset? The only other thing that happened at this time is that John the Baptist was murdered, executed. And that's confirmed in Moses of Corinne's account, where he says of this battle, it was as if by divine providence that vengeance was taken for the death of John the Baptist. They were down there because of the death of John the Baptist. It directly implies that John the Baptist must have been linked to the Edessan royal family. Otherwise, they would not have been down there. Edessa is a long, long way north of Judea to send an army all the way down there to go and punish Herod Antipas. John the Baptist must have been an Edessan prince or an Edessan priest, something closely linked to Edessa. So from that one little section, suddenly we know that Edessa is central to this story. That's interesting. We've already set the scene that Edessa is going to be there in this story somewhere. And so we have another one. So if we go, to Acts of the Apostles, we have another link with Edessa. So this comes from Acts 11:28, and if you read it, you will have no idea that it's talking about Edessa. So it says, Agabus stood up, he was a prophet apparently, and signified that there would be a great famine throughout the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. This is about AD 50 or something of that nature. The disciples determined to send famine relief money to their brethren in Judea, which they did, and they sent it to the elders by the hands of Saul and Barnabas. Okay, well, this is just a normal verse that you might skip over if you're just reading it. But who is Agabus and what is this famine relief? Well, this famine relief money is very famous because we have lots of accounts of it. We have an account from Josephus, from Moses of Corinne, even some of the Roman historians mention it. This was a great famine in Judea, and the person who gave the famine relief money was Queen Helena of the Adiabeni. We know this from history. Lots of people say this. Okay, so how does that link with the story in Acts? Well, for a start, Adiabeni, I think, is a fictitious place. It doesn't exist. There is no evidence for Adiabeni being a principality, a city-state or anything. It's supposed to be over in Iraq, down by Mosul, miles away from anywhere. I don't think it exists. And we get a good idea of that from Moses of Corinne And he says that Queen Helena of the Adiabeni was married to King Abgarus of Edessa. So she was an Edessan queen, not this fictitious place known as Adiabeni. So she was the queen of Edessa. So it was the Edessans who were sending this famine relief money down to Judea. And now we know who Agabus is. Agabus is King Abgarus, the king of Edessa. So again, it was the king of Edessa who was, it was the Edessan monarchy combined who were sending this famine relief money down to Judea. But the interesting thing is that this famine relief money was sent by the hands of Saul and Barnabas. It means that Saul, who wrote most of the New Testament, was an ambassador of Edessa. That is how close this city is to the gospel story. Saul, who wrote all of the epistles, and he had a big hand, we think, in Luke and Acts. A lot of Acts is in the first person. I did this, I did that. He was an ambassador of Edessa. So Edessa was central. and this change in the name of King Abgarus to Agabus, they've just swapped it around a little. Now, they do this all the time in the Talmud. It's just fairly standard. They love their wordplay. I mean, they were wordsmiths. So they play with words all the time. And what they've done here is by changing it from Abgarus to Agabus. Agabus means locust. And every time we'll see this again in other quotes. Every time they're talking about the Edessan monarchy, they call them locusts because they didn't like them. Because as we'll see in a minute, it was the Edessan monarchy that led the Jewish revolt that ended up with the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. And so the classical Orthodox type Jews, Pharisees and Sadducees, they didn't like them. And so they called them locusts because they compared them to the locusts of the plagues, the 10 plagues of Egypt. The locusts came out of the east and destroyed the land and sent the Israelites onto an exodus. Well, the Edessan monarchy did exactly the same. They came out of the east from Parthia. They destroyed Judea and they sent all of the Jews onto an exodus. So they're saying, they're no better than the locusts of the plagues. So that's why we get this little bit of wordplay here. So
and when was the Edessan Exodus, the first one?
That was after the Jewish revolt. So it wasn't really an Edessan exodus. After the Jewish revolt, when Rome destroyed Jerusalem, they exiled all of the Jews. I mean, in Josephus, I think he says that they exiled 2 million people out of Judea or something. He always exaggerates. So let's divide by 10. Let's say it was 200,000 people. But anyway, an awful lot of people were exiled out of Judea and were taken as, they were either exiled or taken as slaves into the Roman Empire. So much so that the price of slaves dropped. And you could end up getting, 30 slaves for 1 shekel sort of thing, He makes a bit of a joke on the price of slaves going down. So yes, they were all exiled out of Jerusalem after the Jewish revolt, which was in AD 70, and we'll come across that again. And we could also have a look at the vineyards as well. parable of the vineyard owner. This is repeated several times in the New Testament. So let's look at Matthew 21:33, because this gives us a good idea about the politics of this era. Because if you read the gospel story, it's as if it's occurring in its own little bubble, nothing to do with the rest of the world. But of course, this was Roman territory. This was central to Rome. Rome didn't like any revolutionaries within the empire. And we know that Jesus was a revolutionary. Rome was not going to be impressed by this. And that's why we ended up with the Jewish revolt and the destruction of Judea. This is the scene that sets the gospel story, and we'll see why in a minute. But anyway, this is Jesus, and he's talking about it's a parable about a vineyard owner. He says there was a lord who planted a vineyard and let it out to a tenant and went to a far country. And when the harvest drew near, he sent his servants to the tenant that he might receive his rent. But the tenant took his servants and beat one and killed another. So when the Lord, the absentee landlord, comes to the vineyard, what will he do to these tenants? He will miserably destroy these wicked men and let out his vineyard to another tenant who will pay their rent on time. Mm-hmm. So this is Jesus, who is upholding the rights of absentee landlords to kill their tenants if they don't pay their rent on time. Mm. Where is the man of the people, Jesus, in this parable? Now, to get around this, if you read any of the concordance on the New Testament, they say, oh yes, but the vineyard is the church and various other things. They have to try and get around it somehow, because this is not what the Jesus character that they're promoting should be preaching. So what does this parable mean? Well, it is a parable. It can be read on two levels, like all parables. And so all we need to do to understand this parable is remember that this was first century Judea, which Rome controlled Judea at the time. And the Jesus character was a king of Edessa. And then we can reread this and get a new meaning for it. So all we need to do is change the landlord to the Edessan king, because the Edessans owned many of these lands, of course, in this region. And the tenant is the Romans. So we read it again, and it becomes, there was an Edessan king who had lands in Judea. Yes, they did. Queen Helena became the queen of Judea, as we'll see in a minute. And they let it out to the Romans and went to a far country. He went back to Edessa. And when the harvest drew near, he sent his servants to the Romans that he might receive his rent for his lands. But the Romans took the servants and beat one and killed another. So when the Edessan king of these lands comes, what will he do to these Romans? He will miserably destroy these wicked Romans and let out his lands to another tenant who will pay their rent on time. This was the political situation that underpins the gospel story. It was a tax dispute. The Edessans, we'll go through their history in a minute, had been given their lands tax-free by Emperor Augustus when they settled those lands. But now the Romans were on these lands, and they were not only not paying rent for being on their lands, they were actually demanding tribute taxes from the Edessans. So, as the landlord of these lands, the Romans were not only refusing to pay rent as good tenants, they were demanding rent from the landlord. What sort of tenant demands rent from the landlord? That's the problem that they were facing. That's what this parable is talking about. It's talking about a tax dispute because the Romans were on Edessan lands. They considered these lands to be their own. Queen Helena became the Queen of Judea. We might have some pictures of this. Did I close? I think I closed that. Oh, it's the cat is back again. There we go.
Yeah, she always has to make at least one.
No talk is complete without the cat being there. Oh, here it is. It's just disappeared off my page. Okay, so I'll go to share screen and we'll have a quick look at that picture. So let's share screen. There we go. So that should come up with a pile of stones. This is a dig just to the south of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And this is the palace of Queen Helena of Edessa. So in the AD 50s, she converted to Judaism. She became a Nazarene Jew, the same sect as Jesus himself. And she went south and she became effectively the de facto Queen of Judea. And she had the largest palace in Jerusalem. And this is the remains of her palace that they're excavating. It's called the Giovanni parking lot excavation, I think. They won't even mention Queen Helena as a part of the excavation. But this is supposed to be her palace in Jerusalem. And this is her tomb. She had the largest tomb in Jerusalem, was owned by Queen Helena of Edessa. And it was Queen Helena who bought the gold menorah for the temple. So they had this big solid gold menorah in the temple. That was bought by the Edessan monarchy for the Temple of Jerusalem. And that candelabra, when it was taken by the Romans, paid for the Colosseum in Rome. That's how much gold was in this candelabra. That's how Vespasian was able to make the Colosseum, because he had all of this money from the temple when they destroyed Jerusalem. And
can I just ask something? When you say Nazarene Jews, does that have anything to do with the city of Nazareth?
No, because Nazareth did not exist in this era. Okay. So in the first century, there is no mention anywhere of Nazareth. That is why most people think that they're talking about a sect here, because Jesus was a Nazarene. And they say he was of Nazareth, so he can become a Nazarene. But he's called a Nazarene. And I'm just going to quickly look up because I can't remember the verse.
Because in German, he actually has the title Jesus von Nazareth, which means Jesus of Nazareth.
Yes, but he's also called Jesus. If you look at sort of Mark 16:6, yes, he's called Jesus of Nazareth. But he's also called the Nazarene, which comes from the old Nazarites. So the Nazarites were a Judaic sect, back in the Old Testament times. The Nazarites were a sect, and it means to separate oneself off from the community, a bit like the Essenes did when they separated themselves off and went to the Dead Sea down at Qumran. And Nazarene also means to separate yourself off. So it's quite obvious, although some people deny it, that a Nazarene, first century Nazarene, was based upon the Nazarite of the Old Testament.
Mhm.
And it says in Matthew 2:23 about Jesus, he lived in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled by the prophets that he will be called a Nazarene. So it wasn't just of Nazareth, he was called the Nazarene. And Saul was also called the Nazarene. And it specifically said of Saul that he belonged to the sect of the Nazarene. So they're calling it a sect of Judaism called the Nazarene. So it's quite obvious that to anyone with a critical eye that he didn't come from Nazareth, because Nazareth did not exist in the first century. He was actually a Nazarene. Now that links in as well, because the Talmud specifically says that Queen Helena became a Nazarene.
Mhm.
So she didn't join any particular normal sect of Judaism. She became a Nazarene, and she underwent 7 years of an initiation in order to become a Nazarene. So Queen Helena and Jesus and Saul were all Nazarene. Why? Well, because they all came from Edessa. The Saul bit is from Acts 24:5. And it says, we found this man a pestilent fellow, because Saul was very pestilent, a mover of sedition amongst the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene. So Saul was also a Nazarene. And by sect, in the original Greek, it means heresy, the heresy of the Nazarene. So yeah, it was a particular sect of Judaism. So yeah, this is her tomb, and this, sorry, that was her tomb, and this is her sarcophagus. Now this sarcophagus went missing. So there's a bit of a story on this one. It was taken to the Louvre in the 19th century by de Soucy, I think his name was, a French archaeologist. So I went to the Louvre to go and take some photos of it, and it wasn't there. So I went to the curator, and they said there's no such thing. And I said, well, I think there is. But anyway, they denied any knowledge of it. So I went back to London again. And eventually I found some old cuttings from the Times of London that had an article saying that this sarcophagus was sent to the Louvre. So I sent these cuttings to the Louvre and said, look, you do have this. I want to see it. And they, after a while, because this was all done by letter, there was no email in those days.
Mhm.
And they finally got back to me and said, yes, we found it in a warehouse.
Well,
So I'm imagining this vast warehouse full of boxes, something out of, um, um, Raiders of the Lost Ark or something. And so they found it, and they said, we're going to put it into the museum. So that's great. That's fine. So I went to the Louvre, and it wasn't there. So I went to the curator again and said, look, you said you were going to put this sarcophagus on show. Where is it? Oh, they said, we've sent it to Israel. Because they were opening a new museum or something. So they sent this sarcophagus to Israel. So I had to go back to London and wait another 6 months until it came back from Israel. And then I went to the Louvre to go and see it. But anyway, this was the sarcophagus that came out of this tomb. Now, this tomb had many burials in it, of course, but this one has the Queen written on it. And that's why people think that this was the sarcophagus of Queen Helena of Adiabene. So yes, she was the queen, the de facto queen of the Jews. And therefore any son of hers would be called the king of the Jews, because she was the queen of the Jews. Although she's not honored as such nowadays, if you go around Jerusalem, you'll not see any statues or memory of Queen Helena there. But she was the Queen of the Jews. And there we get another link with the gospel story. So I shall...
the sarcophagus is something that we usually would associate with Egypt. Did the other peoples around Egypt just adopt it?
Yeah, no, they were quite common in the Near East. So if you were rich, you had a large sarcophagus all over Syria. I mean, Syria, you have some enormous, hugely ornate, hugely expensive sarcophagi. If you look outside the Istanbul Museum, archaeological museum, there are some vast porphyry. Porphyry is like a purple stone, almost like a granite, so it's quite hard. Enormous great sarcophagi, which they took out of Syria. So this is when Turkey used to control Syria, and so they took all of these artifacts out of Syria. So yeah, Syria was hugely rich, and if you could afford one, you had an enormous great sarcophagus. If you were poorer, or if you were more Judaic, you would normally put the body into an underground tomb, you might call it. It's part of a necropolis, but it's only temporary. So you put the body down there for 3 years, I think they used to put them down there, until the body rots away. And then you go and pick up all the bones and you put them into an ossuary. So that was a small sarcophagus because it only needed to fit the long bones of the leg. You know, that's how big it had to be. It was less than a meter long. And then you could put the ossuary into a small tomb. And then instead of having a huge, very expensive sarcophagus, you could have one that was only 1/3 the size or 1/4 the size. And that's how most people buried their dead in Judea. They would put them into a tomb as a part of a necropolis. So the Edessans had a necropolis over in Edessa. The Haran is a town that's just south of Edessa, very big town in the 1st century. They had an enormous great necropolis to the east of the city, which would have held thousands of bodies on a temporary basis, because you only leave the body there for 3 years or so. So it was big business in those days. Whoever controlled the necropolis was obviously very rich, because there was a lot of money spent on the dead. And when I went to Cappadocia in southern Turkey, I think there has been a misidentification at Cappadocia. They say that Cappadocia is a city. This is where everyone was living underground in these, big tunnels and so on. I don't think it was a city at all, or most of it was not a city. I think it was a necropolis. Because when you go there and they show you around these big tunnels and so on, invariably you will get a like a chapel, a small church, and then next to it you get a tomb with spaces to put bodies, and then the next recess inside because these are all in caves, so you're all inside the rock face. The next one is a dining hall for the Last Supper. So this was a big thing back in the era. You would go to a chapel, very much as we might do within Christianity. You take the body to a chapel. There is some sort of religious service with everyone around in this chapel, blessing the dead, whatever they do. Then you take the body and you put it somewhere. Now, in Christianity, you might bury the body, but in Syria, you would put it into one of these tombs for the body to rot away. And then you go and have the Last Supper. And so there's this enormous great dining hall, which was all made of stone, and you have a big meal in celebration of the dead. It was the Last Supper. And that was often portrayed on the top of the sarcophagi. So if you look at the sarcophagi from Palmyra, for instance, which was a very rich city out in the Syrian desert, they will have these tombs, and on the top is a person who is the dead having the Last Supper. So the dead is actually having the Last Supper with the people who are celebrating at the Last Supper meal. And they're all at the Last Supper together, as it were. And this was quite common. There was lots of burials around Syria had exactly the same thing.
Were all
And just
these necropolis, were they all underground?
most of them, because obviously the body smells. And so you want to keep it as sealed as possible while the body is rotting away. So most of them were underground. Even the Edessan one. So the Edessan necropolis is at Sogmatar, which is just to the southeast of Edessa. And they had, this was a royal necropolis. It wasn't for anyone. So they had these round towers on the top of hills. And I wonder if I can just pick up a image.
You
So
know
we can.
why I ask? I have visited one in Buenos Aires, but that was not underground. It's practically like a cemetery,
Oh,
but
yes.
it has all these, yeah, how can I say that? Little buildings, and there are streets, and it's huge, and you can walk and walk, but all of it is graves. But they
Mm.
built these little buildings, and they are sealed and shut, so then nothing is smelling there. And
Okay,
a
maybe
lot
that's
of
a,
the architecture reminded me of Freemason.
yeah, maybe that's a, well, yes, it's very like similar to Mithras, really, isn't it? Um, they do the same, but it's the same as if you go to the catacombs of Rome or the
Mhm.
catacombs of Paris, where underneath Rome there was all these catacombs where they used to put the dead. But again, the dead did not necessarily stay there indefinitely. Sometimes they were taken away again and put somewhere else. Same in Paris, and I've seen estimates in Paris that the catacombs there have spaces for millions of people. So yeah, it was big business and big money if you could get into the necropolis business.
Hmm.
Yeah, lots of money was spent on it. I was just going to pick up this image here. So let me open this image. So where are you in that page? Okay, so if I move it across into that page so I can grab hold of it and do a screen share. So that should be coming up as a screen share. Now, these are strange. These are not the same as most of the necropolises. So in Edessa, this is the Edessan necropolis at Sogmatar. And they built on the top of these little hills, these little drums made of stone, of course. These are they're only about 2 meters high. They're not very high. But underneath, there's a shaft that goes down underneath, and underneath you get this, and this is where you put your dead. So this one would have room for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 5 people.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously you can't leave the body there forever because it will become full very quickly. So again, this was just somewhere to put the body for 3, 4 years until they rot away. And this was the necropolis of the Edessan monarchy. And at the front of this, the shaft that went down to underneath this drum, I think, yeah, that's the shaft here. This one's filled up with stone, so you can't go down it. But anyway, that's the shaft there. But there was a rolling stone on the entrance. So you could roll a stone up, go in there, do whatever you needed to do, and then you unchock it and the rolling stone would roll back into position. So they did have rolling stones on their entrance to their tombs, which is very biblical, of course. That's exactly as we see with Jesus. So yeah, that's interesting. So we see these connections between Edessa and the gospel story. So how did we get there? We got there from Egypt. So this is where we get slightly speculative, you might say, because we don't have all the information. But what happened is that I think these people came out of Egypt. That's why their religion is slightly different to standard Judaism. That's why Jesus was known as the Egyptian false prophet. So within the works of Moses of Corine, within Acts of the Apostles and Josephus, this guy is called the Egyptian false prophet. I don't know if you've heard that term.
Yes, I heard it in one of your lectures, but I never heard it before.
Yeah. Now, obviously, in classical Christianity, they will say the Egyptian false prophet is someone completely different, of course. But it was the Egyptian false prophet who took the 5,000 out into the wilderness. It was the Egyptian false prophet who had that meeting on the Mount of Olives, which was interrupted by the Roman guard. It's quite clear that the Egyptian false prophet was actually the Jesus character. And of course, we know that Jesus went to Egypt for his education. He fled, supposedly fled to Egypt for his youth. Now, that's exactly what these monarchs would have done, because they sent their monarchs to have a good education wherever they had to go to. And of course, the greatest university in that era was at Alexandria. If you wanted a good education, you went to Alexandria, you went to Egypt. And I'm pretty sure that that's where these princes, the Jesus character, actually went to. So he was something to do with Egypt. Why? Well, because let's go back to Queen Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. Now, they had already had a son, Caesarion, but when Caesar was killed on 44, I think it was BC, when he was killed on the Ides of March, Cicero says that Cleopatra was pregnant. And he's worried by this because he doesn't want a scion of Caesar. He doesn't want an heir, an Egyptian heir to the throne of Rome. So he's very worried about this. But then later on, a few months later, the problem has gone away. So why was that? Well, the problem would only go away because Cicero was hoping that Cleopatra would have a miscarriage. So either she had a miscarriage or the child was a girl, because a girl could not become emperor of Rome. And then Cicero was happy. So we hear nothing more about this lost child of Cleopatra. She had another 2 children with Mark Antony, of course, until we run on about 20 years. And now Augustus is becoming the emperor, as it were, of Rome. And he wants to sort out his empire. So to Yuba II, who was the king of North Africa, Mauritania they call it, but it was basically North Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya. He gave that king a daughter of Cleopatra, who was known as Cleopatra Selene. So he got quite a prize. He got a daughter of Cleopatra, who was an incarnation of Isis. She was very famous. And yeah, so she was sent to the king of North Africa. And then he wanted to sort out his eastern borders. And so he went to Phraates IV, who was the king of Parthia or Persia, and gave Phraates IV a concubine, a prostitute called Thermusa. And of course, that's not going to work. You can't go to the king of all Parthia, who was the great enemy of Rome. Parthia had defeated Rome on 2-3 occasions prior to this. You had to do something really special to placate, the great king of Parthia. And so he gives the king of Parthia this courtesan, this prostitute called Thermusa. That's not going to work.
Yeah.
But Phraates IV was so impressed with his concubine that he made her the chief queen of the whole of Parthia. Quite clearly, she was much more well connected than Josephus is trying to make out. And a lot of people thought this story was just made up by Josephus until people started finding the coins of Thermusa in the record. And I wonder if we've got a...
Just one quick question. What would you tell somebody that is saying, yeah, well, it's true, Jesus, the family had to fled. They fled to Egypt. And but once those people died that wanted to kill the child, they came back. There's nothing more to the story.
Yes, well, they did come back, of course. And that's part of the story, because they came back so he could become the king of Judea. Now, they didn't have any specific claims very easily over Egypt. It was very difficult for them to take over Egypt, but they could take over Judea. And so that, I think, is what they did. So it does accord with the story. And I was just going to share a screen here to give you a picture. So if I go to share screen, come on, share screen. There we go. And have a look at that one and share that. That should be coming up now.
Yeah.
Okay, so a lot of people thought Josephus was just telling a ribald tale about this concubine courtesan, because there was no real history for her. It's pretty much only Josephus talks about her. But then they started finding her coins in the archaeology of the East. And this is a coin of Thermusa, who became known as Queen Theamusa Orania. That's her title. And her son. So this is her son. So she's on the right-hand side. Obviously, that's Queen Theamusa Orania. And on the left is her son, Phraates V, who became known to history as Phraatesses. So this was a real couple. They were real people. Josephus was telling us pretty much the truth. He has a very biased truth, of course, because he was writing for Rome, so he was subservient to Rome. But he gives us some fairly good history. So what I'm saying is that this lady, Theamusa Orania, was the daughter of Cleopatra. And if we look at her statue, because they even found her statue in the end, I think there is a bit of a similarity there. So Theamusa Orania is on the right and Cleopatra is on the left.
This was the public hour. For full access of the entire interview, please join our Patreon community. Thank you.